Some secrets are worth losing everything for. In the shadowy corridors of royal power, where loyalty is currency and silence is golden, one man's conscience would shatter the unbreakable code of the palace guard. What happens when protecting the truth becomes more important than protecting the crown? When a decorated royal guard discovers something that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy, he faces an impossible choice: remain silent and keep his prestigious position, or speak out and lose everything he has worked for his entire life. This is the story of Marcus Wellington, a man who chose honor over security, truth over comfort, and justice over personal gain. His decision would not only cost him his career, but would also expose a web of palace intrigue that reached the highest levels of the royal household. Sometimes, the greatest act of service requires the ultimate sacrifice. Marcus Wellington had always believed that serving the royal family was the highest honor a man could achieve. Standing at 6'2" with broad shoulders and a stern expression that had been shaped by 15 years of military discipline, he commanded respect wherever he walked through the palace corridors. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his dedication to duty was legendary among his fellow guards. The morning of September 15th began like any other for Marcus. He arrived at the palace at 5:30 in the morning, exactly as he had done for the past 8 years since joining the Royal Protection Unit. The early morning mist hung low over the palace gardens, and the ancient stones of the building seemed to whisper stories of centuries past. Marcus loved these quiet moments before the palace came alive with the daily rush of royal duties, staff meetings, and endless protocols. As he made his way to the security briefing room, Marcus reflected on his journey to this prestigious position. Born in a small Yorkshire town to a family of modest means, he had joined the army at 18, driven by a desire to serve his country and perhaps escape the limitations of his humble beginnings. His exceptional performance in the military, particularly his skills in personal protection and his unwavering integrity, had caught the attention of palace recruiters who were always looking for outstanding individuals to join the royal guard. The transition from military service to palace duty had not been easy. The protocols were different, more complex, and the stakes felt higher. Protecting members of the royal family required not just physical courage but also discretion, intelligence, and an ability to blend into the background while remaining constantly alert. Marcus had excelled at all of these requirements, earning the respect of his superiors and the trust of the royal family members he was assigned to protect. His current assignment was one of the most important in the palace: personal protection for Queen Consort Camilla. This role required him to be present during her public engagements, private meetings, and social gatherings. He had been specifically chosen for this position because of his impeccable record, his ability to remain calm under pressure, and his reputation for absolute discretion. In 8 years of service, Marcus had never spoken publicly about anything he had witnessed during his duties, understanding that the trust placed in him was sacred. The security briefing that morning was conducted by Chief Inspector Harrison, a veteran of the Royal Protection Unit who had served for over 20 years. Harrison was a no-nonsense man who commanded the respect of all the guards under his supervision. He had seen many guards come and go, and he had a keen eye for spotting those who had the right qualities for long-term service in the palace. "Gentlemen," Harrison began as the 12 guards assembled in the briefing room settled into their seats, "today's schedule includes several important events that will require our full attention. Her Majesty the Queen Consort has a private lunch meeting with Lady Victoria Pemberton at noon, followed by a charity board meeting at 3 o'clock. The evening will conclude with a small dinner party for close friends and supporters of the Children's Hospital charity." Marcus took notes carefully, as he always did, mentally mapping out the security requirements for each event. He had learned early in his career that preparation was everything in personal protection. Knowing the schedule, understanding the venue, identifying potential risks, and having contingency plans were all essential elements of keeping the people under his protection safe. "Wellington," Harrison called out, "you'll be assigned to close protection throughout the day. I want you to pay particular attention during the charity board meeting. We've received some intelligence suggesting there may be protesters outside the venue, though nothing that should pose a significant threat." Marcus nodded acknowledgement. He had handled protesters before, and while they could be disruptive, they rarely posed a serious security risk. His main concern was always ensuring that the Queen Consort could go about her duties without disruption or embarrassment. As the briefing concluded, Marcus made his way to his assigned station outside the Queen Consort's private office. The corridor was lined with portraits of previous monarchs, their painted eyes seeming to watch over the daily activities of the palace. Marcus had often wondered what these historical figures would think of the modern challenges facing the monarchy, the constant media scrutiny, and the delicate balance between tradition and progress that defined contemporary royal life. The first few hours of the day passed without incident. Marcus maintained his position, occasionally speaking into his radio to coordinate with other security personnel, and keeping a watchful eye on everyone who approached the Queen Consort's office. Palace staff moved efficiently through the corridors, carrying out their various duties with the kind of practiced precision that comes from years of experience in royal service. At 11:45, Marcus received word that it was time to escort the Queen Consort to her lunch meeting. He knocked gently on the office door and entered when beckoned. Camilla was seated at her desk, reviewing some documents, dressed in an elegant navy blue suit that was both appropriate for the formal nature of her lunch meeting and comfortable enough for the afternoon's activities. "Good morning, Wellington," she said with a warm smile. Marcus had always appreciated the Queen Consort's genuine kindness toward the palace staff. Unlike some members of the royal family who maintained a more distant relationship with their security personnel, Camilla often took time to ask about his family and show interest in his well-being. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Marcus replied with a respectful bow. "Are you ready for your lunch appointment?"
"Yes, quite ready."
"I understand there may be some protesters today." "Nothing to be concerned about, Your Majesty. We have everything under control." The drive to the restaurant where the lunch meeting was to take place was uneventful. Marcus sat in the front passenger seat of the royal vehicle, maintaining radio contact with the advanced security team that had already secured the venue. As they arrived, he could see a small group of protesters gathered across the street, holding signs about various social issues. They were peaceful and well contained behind police barriers, exactly as the intelligence report had indicated. The lunch with Lady Victoria Pemberton proceeded smoothly. Marcus positioned himself discreetly near the entrance to the private dining room, where he could observe both the Queen Consort and monitor anyone entering or leaving the area. Lady Pemberton was a long-time friend and supporter of various royal charities, and their conversation focused on upcoming fundraising events and the progress of several charitable initiatives. It was during the charity board meeting later that afternoon that Marcus first noticed something unusual. The meeting was being held in a conference room at the charity's headquarters, a modern building in central London that had been thoroughly secured by the advanced team. Marcus was stationed outside the conference room, able to hear portions of the discussion through the partially open door. The meeting seemed to be progressing normally, with discussions about fundraising targets, upcoming events, and the allocation of charitable funds. However, Marcus began to notice that some of the conversation seemed to drift away from charitable matters toward more personal topics. He heard mentions of media management, image rehabilitation, and strategic positioning that seemed more related to public relations than to helping sick children. As someone who had been trained to notice details and remain alert to anything unusual, Marcus found himself paying closer attention to the conversation. His role was to protect the Queen Consort from physical threats, but his experience had taught him that sometimes the greatest dangers to the royal family came not from obvious threats, but from more subtle forms of manipulation or exploitation. During a break in the meeting, Marcus overheard a conversation between two of the board members who had stepped outside the conference room. They were speaking in hushed tones about financial arrangements and personal benefits that seemed completely unrelated to the charity's stated mission. One of them mentioned specific amounts of money and what appeared to be plans for diverting charitable funds for personal use. Marcus felt a knot forming in his stomach. If what he was overhearing was accurate, it suggested that some members of this charity board were involved in financial misconduct, potentially using the charity as a vehicle for personal enrichment while trading on their association with the royal family. The implications were serious not just for the individuals involved, but for the reputation of the Queen Consort and the monarchy as a whole. The remainder of the afternoon passed slowly for Marcus as he struggled to process what he had heard. His training had prepared him to deal with physical threats, security breaches, and emergency situations, but it had not prepared him for the moral dilemma he now faced. If there was indeed financial misconduct occurring within this charity, and if the Queen Consort was unknowingly associated with it, then her reputation and the reputation of the royal family could be severely damaged if the truth eventually came to light. As they returned to the palace that evening, Marcus found himself lost in thought about his responsibilities. His primary duty was to protect the Queen Consort from harm, but what constituted harm in this situation? Was it more harmful to remain silent about potential wrongdoing, or to speak up and potentially create a scandal that could damage the monarchy? The evening dinner party was held in one of the palace's smaller dining rooms, an intimate gathering of about 20 people who were supporters of the Children's Hospital charity. Marcus maintained his usual professional demeanor throughout the event, but his mind was preoccupied with the ethical dilemma he faced. He watched as the Queen Consort interacted warmly with the guests, her genuine concern for the charity's mission evident in every conversation. It was during this dinner party that Marcus overheard another disturbing conversation. Two of the guests who had also been present at the afternoon board meeting were discussing what they called the arrangement in more specific terms. They mentioned specific amounts of money that were being redirected from charitable donations into personal accounts, and they spoke about how the Royal Association provided perfect cover for their activities. One of them mentioned that they had been careful to keep the Queen Consort unaware of the true nature of their financial arrangements, suggesting that she was an unwitting participant in what appeared to be a sophisticated fraud scheme. This revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. The woman he was sworn to protect was being used as unknowing cover for criminal activity that would inevitably damage her reputation and possibly lead to legal consequences for everyone involved. As the evening concluded and Marcus escorted the Queen Consort back to her private quarters, he made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He could not remain silent about what he had discovered. The Queen Consort deserved to know the truth about the people she was associating with, and the royal family deserved protection from the scandal that would inevitably erupt if these activities continued unchecked. That night, Marcus lay awake in his small apartment near the palace, staring at the ceiling as he contemplated the consequences of speaking out. He knew that revealing what he had overheard would almost certainly cost him his job. The palace demanded absolute loyalty and discretion from its staff, and speaking publicly about private conversations, even to protect the royal family, would be seen as a breach of trust. But Marcus also knew that his silence could lead to far greater damage. If this charity fraud continued and was eventually exposed by the media or law enforcement, the Queen Consort would face accusations of either complicity or incompetence. The monarchy could face a crisis of confidence that would be far more damaging than the temporary scandal created by Marcus's revelations. As dawn broke over London, Marcus had made his decision. He would document everything he had witnessed, gather whatever evidence he could, and then approach his superiors with the information. He understood that this decision would likely end his career in royal service, but he believed that protecting the institution of the monarchy from long-term damage was more important than protecting his own position within it. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the palace with a heavy heart but a clear conscience. He had spent his entire adult life in service to his country and his sovereign, and he believed that continuing that service now required the greatest sacrifice he could make. Giving up everything he had worked for, in order to protect the people and institution he had sworn to serve. Little did Marcus know that his decision to speak out would set in motion a chain of events that would expose corruption at the highest levels of society, challenge the very foundations of royal protocol, and ultimately redefine what it means to serve with honor and integrity. His journey from loyal palace guard to whistleblower would test every principle he held dear, and force him to discover reserves of courage he never knew he possessed. The stage was set for a confrontation between institutional loyalty and personal integrity, between the comfort of silence and the danger of truth, between the security of conformity and the uncertainty of moral courage. Marcus Wellington was about to discover that sometimes the greatest act of service requires the ultimate sacrifice, and that true loyalty sometimes demands the courage to stand alone against overwhelming odds. The morning sun cast long shadows across Marcus Wellington's desk as he sat in his small office reviewing the notes he had carefully compiled over the past week. Since overhearing those disturbing conversations at the charity meeting, Marcus had been methodically documenting every suspicious interaction he witnessed, every questionable conversation he overheard, and every piece of evidence that supported his growing conviction that the Queen Consort was being used as unwitting cover for a sophisticated fraud operation. His investigation had revealed a pattern of behavior that was far more extensive than he had initially realized. The charity board members who had spoken so carelessly about financial arrangements were part of a larger network of individuals who had been systematically exploiting their royal connections for personal gain. They had been careful to keep their activities hidden from the Queen Consort herself, but their conversations revealed a callous disregard for both the charitable cause they were supposed to be serving and the royal reputation they were putting at risk. Marcus had always prided himself on his attention to detail, a skill that had served him well throughout his military career and his time in royal service. Now, he was applying that same methodical approach to building a case that could expose this corruption while protecting the Queen Consort from the inevitable fallout. He understood that the success of his efforts would depend on having irrefutable evidence that would be difficult for anyone to dismiss or discredit. The challenge he faced was gathering this evidence without compromising his position or alerting the perpetrators to his investigation. As a royal protection officer, Marcus had access to many private conversations and confidential meetings, But using that access to gather evidence against individuals associated with the royal family created serious ethical and legal complications. He needed to be certain that his actions were not only morally justified, but also legally sound. Over the past several days, Marcus had been maintaining his normal duties while carefully observing and listening during his assignments with the Queen Consort. He had attended 3 more charity-related events, and at each one, he had witnessed further evidence of the financial misconduct that was occurring. The pattern was always the same: public discussions about charitable goals and achievements, followed by private conversations about personal financial arrangements and plans for redirecting charitable funds. During a particularly revealing incident at a fundraising gala, Marcus had positioned himself near a balcony where several board members had stepped outside for what they believed was a private conversation. Their discussion had been shockingly explicit about their methods for skimming money from charitable donations, and they had laughed about how easy it was to maintain their scheme while basking in the prestige of their royal association. One of them had bragged about purchasing a new yacht with money that had been diverted from donations intended for medical equipment at the children's hospital. Another had described elaborate vacations funded by charitable contributions that were supposed to be going toward research grants for pediatric cancer treatment. Their casual attitude toward stealing money from sick children while using the Queen Consort's reputation as cover was beyond Marcus's ability to rationalize or ignore. The weight of this knowledge was taking a toll on Marcus both professionally and personally. He found it increasingly difficult to maintain his usual demeanor during his interactions with the Queen Consort, knowing that she was unknowingly providing legitimacy to people who were betraying everything she believed in. Her genuine compassion for the charitable causes she supported made their exploitation of her goodwill even more offensive to Marcus's sense of justice. Marcus had also begun to notice that his behavior changes had not gone unobserved by his colleagues and superiors. Chief Inspector Harrison had commented on Marcus's apparent distraction during recent security briefings, and several fellow guards had asked if everything was all right. Marcus knew that he could not maintain this double life indefinitely, and that he would soon need to either abandon his investigation or take decisive action based on what he had discovered. The decision point came during a meeting that Marcus was assigned to monitor as part of his regular duties. The Queen Consort was meeting with the chairman of the Children's Hospital Charity to discuss the upcoming annual fundraising campaign. Marcus was positioned outside the meeting room, but the door was slightly ajar, and he could hear most of the conversation clearly. The chairman, a distinguished gentleman named Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, who had been involved with the charity for over 15 years, was presenting what appeared to be very encouraging financial reports. He spoke enthusiastically about donation levels, successful fundraising events, and the positive impact that the charity's work was having on the lives of sick children. The Queen Consort responded with obvious pleasure and satisfaction, praising the dedication of the charity's board and volunteers. However, Marcus knew from his investigation that many of the financial figures being presented were either exaggerated or completely false. Money that Sir Geoffrey was claiming had been spent on medical equipment and research grants had actually been diverted into personal accounts controlled by various board members. The success stories being shared were either outdated or fabricated entirely to maintain the illusion of effective charitable work. As Marcus listened to this presentation, he realized that the Queen Consort was not just being used as unwitting cover for fraud. She was being actively deceived about the effectiveness and integrity of an organization that bore her public endorsement. Her reputation was being built on lies, and when the truth eventually emerged, as Marcus was certain it would, she would face not only embarrassment but potentially serious questions about her judgment and oversight of the charitable organizations she supported. This realization crystallized Marcus's understanding of his moral obligation. He was not just a witness to financial misconduct, he was watching someone he was sworn to protect being systematically deceived and manipulated. His duty to protect the Queen Consort extended beyond physical safety to include protecting her reputation and dignity from those who would exploit her trust for personal gain. After the meeting concluded, Marcus made his decision. He would approach Chief Inspector Harrison with his evidence and request guidance on how to proceed. Harrison was a man of integrity who had dedicated his career to protecting the royal family, and Marcus believed he would understand the serious nature of the situation and provide appropriate guidance. The next morning, Marcus requested a private meeting with Chief Inspector Harrison. They met in Harrison's office, a sparse but comfortable room decorated with photographs from various royal events and commendations Harrison had received during his long career. Harrison listened carefully as Marcus explained what he had witnessed and provided the documentation he had gathered over the past weeks. Harrison's reaction was initially one of skepticism, followed by growing concern as Marcus presented increasingly compelling evidence of the fraud scheme. As a veteran of royal protection, Harrison understood immediately the serious implications of what Marcus was describing. If these allegations were true, they represented not just criminal activity, but a potential crisis for the monarchy that could have far-reaching consequences. "Wellington," Harrison said after reviewing Marcus's documentation, "you understand that what you're alleging here could create an enormous scandal. If you're wrong about any of this, it could destroy the reputations of several prominent individuals who have given years of service to important charitable causes." "I understand that, sir," Marcus replied. "But I also understand that if I'm right and we do nothing, the scandal will be far worse when this eventually comes to light through other means. The Queen Consort deserves to know the truth about the people she's associating with, and she deserves protection from the consequences of their actions." Harrison stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the palace gardens as he considered Marcus's words. After several minutes of silence, he turned back to Marcus with a grave expression. "If we pursue this matter, you understand that it will almost certainly end your career here. Even if everything you've alleged proves to be true, the palace will not be able to retain someone who has demonstrated a willingness to investigate and expose individuals connected to the royal family, regardless of the justification." Marcus had expected this warning, but hearing it stated so directly still felt like a physical blow. His career in royal service had defined his adult life, providing him with purpose, pride, and financial security. The thought of losing all of that was frightening, but not as frightening as the prospect of remaining silent while watching the Queen Consort being deceived and exploited. "I understand, sir," Marcus said quietly. "But I believe this is the right thing to do, regardless of the personal consequences."
Harrison nodded slowly, recognizing the courage required for Marcus's decision. "Very well."
"I'll need to discuss this matter with my superiors before we can proceed. In the meantime, I want you to continue your normal duties and avoid any actions that might alert these individuals to your investigation. Can you do that?" Marcus assured Harrison that he could maintain his professional demeanor while the matter was being considered at higher levels. However, the next few days proved to be among the most difficult of his career. He continued his protection duties with the Queen Consort, attending meetings and events where he was forced to interact professionally with individuals he now knew were stealing money from children's charities while using her reputation as cover. The psychological strain of maintaining his silence while watching this deception continue was enormous. During one particularly difficult moment at a charity board meeting, Marcus heard one of the fraudsters discussing plans to purchase expensive jewelry with money that had been donated specifically for cancer research. The casual cruelty of this conversation, conducted just meters away from the Queen Consort, who genuinely believed these people were dedicated servants of charitable causes, nearly broke Marcus's composure entirely. 3 days after his meeting with Harrison, Marcus was summoned to a conference room, where he found not only Harrison, but also Deputy Private Secretary James Whitmore and Legal Counsel Victoria Sterling. The presence of such senior palace officials indicated that his allegations were being taken very seriously at the highest levels of the royal household. Whitmore, a distinguished man in his 50s who had served the royal family for over 20 years, took the lead in questioning Marcus about his evidence and his motivations for coming forward. His questions were thorough and sometimes challenging, as he sought to determine both the credibility of Marcus's allegations and the reliability of Marcus himself as a witness. "Mr. Wellington," Whitmore said, "your service record with us has been exemplary, which gives weight to your allegations. However, you must understand that acting on this information could create significant problems for the royal family, regardless of whether the allegations prove to be true. Are you prepared to accept responsibility for the consequences of your actions?"
Marcus straightened in his chair and met Whitmore's gaze directly.
"Sir, my responsibility is to protect the Queen Consort from harm. I believe that allowing this fraud to continue represents a greater threat to her well-being and reputation than taking action to expose it." Legal counsel Sterling then explained the various options available to the palace. They could conduct their own internal investigation, they could refer the matter to appropriate law enforcement agencies, or they could attempt to address the situation privately with the individuals involved. Each approach had different risks and potential benefits, and each would require different levels of involvement from Marcus as the primary witness. After considerable discussion, it was decided that the matter would be referred to the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Fraud Unit, with the understanding that Marcus would be expected to provide formal testimony about his observations. This decision represented a point of no return for Marcus's career in royal service, as his role as a whistleblower would inevitably become public knowledge during any legal proceedings. As the meeting concluded, Whitmore made the situation crystal clear to Marcus. "Mr. Wellington, we appreciate your dedication to protecting the Queen Consort and we believe that your actions are motivated by genuine concern for her welfare. However, you must understand that once this investigation begins, there will be no possibility of continuing your employment here. The palace cannot retain staff members who have participated in investigations involving individuals connected to the royal family, regardless of the justification. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment contemplating the reality of his situation. Within a matter of days, he would lose the career that had defined his adult life, the colleagues who had become his closest friends, and the financial security that had allowed him to support his elderly parents and plan for his own future. He would become known publicly as the guard who had betrayed the confidence of the royal household, regardless of his motivations or the validity of his concerns. Yet, as difficult as these prospects were, Marcus found that he felt a sense of peace about his decision that had been absent during the weeks of internal struggle preceding it. He had chosen to act according to his conscience rather than his self-interest, and he believed that history would vindicate his decision, even if the immediate consequences were personally devastating. The next morning brought news that would test Marcus's resolve even further. Chief Inspector Harrison informed him that preliminary inquiries had confirmed several aspects of his allegations, and that the formal investigation would begin immediately. However, word of the investigation had somehow leaked, and several individuals connected to the charity had already begun taking steps to protect themselves, including hiring expensive legal representation and beginning their own media campaigns to discredit any potential accusations. Marcus realized that he was no longer just facing the loss of his career. He was entering into a battle with wealthy, well-connected individuals who had significant resources at their disposal and strong motivations to destroy his credibility. The comfortable certainties of his life as a royal guard were about to be replaced by the uncertain and dangerous world of public controversy, legal proceedings, and media scrutiny. As he prepared to take the final steps that would transform him from loyal palace employee to public whistleblower, Marcus wondered if he had the strength to see this fight through to its conclusion. The evidence he had gathered was compelling, but he knew that evidence alone would not be enough to prevail against opponents who had spent years building networks of influence and protection around themselves. The quiet courage that had sustained him through his decision to speak out would now need to evolve into the kind of resilience required to survive in the spotlight of public attention, where every aspect of his character, motivations, and credibility would be subjected to intense scrutiny. Marcus Wellington was about to discover whether his commitment to doing the right thing was strong enough to survive the consequences of actually doing it. The news broke on a cold Tuesday morning in October, sending shockwaves through both the palace and the media establishment. Palace Guard exposes charity fraud linked to Queen Consort, screamed the headline across the front page of the Daily Telegraph, followed by similar stories in every major newspaper and broadcast outlet across the country. Marcus Wellington woke to find himself at the center of the biggest royal scandal in years, with his photograph splashed across front pages and his name trending on social media platforms. Marcus had been expecting this moment for weeks, but the reality of seeing his private decision to do the right thing transformed into a public spectacle was more overwhelming than he had anticipated. His phone had been ringing constantly since 5 a.m, with reporters, producers, and curious members of the public all seeking interviews, comments, or simply more information about the man who had chosen to break the sacred code of palace discretion. The past month had been a whirlwind of activity, as the investigation Marcus had initiated moved forward with startling speed. The Metropolitan Police Fraud Unit had moved quickly once they received the referral from the palace, and their investigation had uncovered evidence that went far beyond even Marcus's most pessimistic assumptions about the scope of the charity fraud. What had begun as his observation of suspicious conversations had evolved into a comprehensive investigation involving multiple charities, dozens of individuals, and millions of pounds in misappropriated donations. Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison, who was leading the police investigation, had been impressed by both the quality of Marcus's evidence and his willingness to cooperate fully with law enforcement despite the personal costs he was facing. During their first formal interview, she had told Marcus that his documentation and testimony had provided investigators with the foundation they needed to uncover a fraud network that might have continued operating for years without his intervention. "Wellington," she had said, "your decision to come forward has potentially saved these charities millions of pounds and protected countless donors from continued exploitation. I want you to understand that what you've done requires genuine courage, and the public interest served by your actions far outweighs any concerns about palace protocol." However, the individuals being investigated had not remained passive while the case against them was being built. As Marcus had feared, they had substantial resources at their disposal and had been using them aggressively to protect themselves and discredit their accusers. Within days of learning about the investigation, they had retained some of London's most expensive and ruthless legal representatives and had begun a coordinated campaign to portray Marcus as a disgruntled employee seeking attention and financial compensation. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, the charity chairman who had been presenting false financial reports to the Queen Consort, had been particularly vocal in his denials and counterattacks. In a carefully orchestrated media campaign, he had portrayed himself as a dedicated public servant whose reputation was being destroyed by the unfounded accusations of a palace employee with questionable motives and reliability. This is nothing more than a vindictive attack by someone who has violated the trust placed in him by the royal household, Sir Geoffrey had declared in a television interview that was broadcast just days after the scandal broke. The allegations being made are completely without merit, and I have complete confidence that a thorough investigation will vindicate everyone involved in this important charitable work. The personal attacks on Marcus had been systematic and vicious. Anonymous sources close to the charity had suggested to reporters that Marcus had a history of financial difficulties and had approached board members seeking loans or other forms of financial assistance that had been refused. Other anonymous sources had questioned Marcus's mental stability, suggesting that the stress of his palace duties had led to paranoid delusions about the people around him. Most painfully for Marcus, some of these attacks had included attempts to portray his decision to speak out as a betrayal of the Queen Consort herself. Several media commentators had suggested that Marcus's actions had created unnecessary embarrassment and difficulty for someone he was supposed to protect, and that his true loyalty should have been to shield her from any unpleasant realities rather than forcing her to confront them. These accusations had been particularly difficult for Marcus to endure because they struck at the heart of his motivation for coming forward. He had acted out of genuine concern for the Queen Consort's welfare and reputation, but he was now being portrayed as someone who had selfishly put his own interests ahead of hers. The suggestion that he had betrayed the person he was trying to protect was more painful than any of the other attacks on his character or credibility. The palace's response to the scandal had been carefully measured, but ultimately supportive of the investigation process. In an official statement released through the press secretary, the royal household had indicated that they took any allegations of misconduct very seriously and would cooperate fully with appropriate law enforcement agencies. However, the statement had also made clear that Marcus Wellington was no longer employed by the palace and that his actions had not been authorized or endorsed by the royal household. This carefully worded statement had been necessary to protect the monarchy from appearing to be involved in or responsible for the investigation, but it also served to emphasize Marcus's isolation from the institution he had spent years serving. He was now officially on his own, without the protection or support of the palace, facing opponents who had significant resources and strong motivations to destroy him. The Queen Consort herself had maintained complete public silence about the scandal, following long-established royal protocol of never commenting publicly on ongoing legal matters. However, sources close to the royal household had indicated privately that she had been deeply shocked and saddened by the revelations about people she had trusted and worked with for years. The same sources suggested that while she understood Marcus's motivations, she was also disappointed by the public nature of the revelations and their impact on the charitable causes she genuinely cared about. Marcus had been hoping for some indication of royal support or understanding, but the palace's need to maintain neutrality meant that any such support would have to remain private and unofficial. This left Marcus facing not only legal and media challenges, but also the psychological burden of wondering whether the person he had been trying to protect appreciated or resented his efforts on her behalf. The financial impact of his decision was becoming increasingly severe. Marcus had been dismissed from his palace position immediately after the scandal broke, losing not only his salary, but also his palace housing and other benefits that had been part of his compensation package. He had been forced to find temporary accommodation in a small flat in South London, and his savings were being rapidly depleted by legal fees and basic living expenses. Several law firms had approached Marcus offering to represent him, but most had made it clear that their services would require substantial upfront payments or percentage agreements that Marcus could not afford. He had eventually found representation through a legal aid organization that specialized in whistleblower cases, but the resources available through this arrangement were limited compared to what his opponents could afford. The media attention had also made it virtually impossible for Marcus to find new employment. His name and photograph were now known throughout the country, and any potential employer would be aware of both his whistleblower status and the controversy surrounding his actions. While some people viewed him as a hero who had courageously exposed corruption, others saw him as someone who could not be trusted to maintain confidentiality or loyalty to his employers. Despite these challenges, Marcus had been encouraged by the progress of the official investigation. The police had been able to verify many of his observations through their own independent investigation, and they had uncovered additional evidence of fraud that went far beyond what Marcus had originally witnessed. Search warrants had been executed at the offices and homes of several charity board members, resulting in the seizure of financial records, computer files, and other documents that supported the allegations of systematic fraud. Bank records had revealed a complex network of financial transactions designed to obscure the movement of charitable donations into personal accounts controlled by board members. Luxury purchases, expensive vacations, and property investments had been traced directly to money that had been donated for children's medical care, cancer research, and hospital equipment. The scope and audacity of the fraud had shocked even experienced financial investigators. 3 board members had already been arrested and charged with fraud, theft, and money laundering, with more arrests expected as the investigation continued. The charity itself had been placed under the supervision of the Charity Commission, and new management had been brought in to attempt to salvage what remained of the organization's legitimate operations. However, the legal process was moving slowly, and Marcus knew that it would likely be many months or even years before the cases were resolved through the court system. In the meantime, he would have to continue living under the cloud of controversy and uncertainty that surrounded his decision to come forward. The psychological toll of the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Marcus had always been a private person who preferred to avoid attention and controversy, and the constant media scrutiny was exhausting and demoralizing. He found himself analyzing every interaction with reporters, lawyers, and investigators, worried that his words might be misinterpreted or taken out of context in ways that could damage the case or his own credibility. Sleep had become elusive, as Marcus found himself replaying events and conversations, second-guessing his decisions, and worrying about what might happen next. The certainties that had structured his life for years had been replaced by constant uncertainty about his future, his finances, and his reputation. He had traded the security of his palace position for the chaos of legal proceedings and media attention, and there were moments when he wondered if he had made the right choice. During one particularly difficult evening, as Marcus sat in his small flat, reading yet another newspaper article questioning his motives and credibility, he received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end identified himself as Colonel James Fitzgerald, a retired military officer who had served in several senior positions within the royal household before his retirement 5 years earlier. "Mr. Wellington," Colonel Fitzgerald said, "I wanted to call to let you know that there are people who understand what you've done and why you did it. Your actions took considerable courage, and while the immediate consequences are difficult, I believe history will vindicate your decision." This unexpected expression of support from someone who understood the palace environment and the pressures Marcus had faced provided a moment of reassurance during an otherwise dark period. Colonel Fitzgerald explained that while palace protocol prevented current officials from expressing public support, many people within the royal household privately respected Marcus's decision to prioritize integrity over personal convenience. "The institution you served will ultimately be stronger because of what you've done," Colonel Fitzgerald continued. "Protecting the monarchy sometimes requires protecting it from those who would exploit its reputation for personal gain. You understood that, even when it meant sacrificing your own position within the institution." As winter deepened and the investigation continued, Marcus began to see signs that public opinion was beginning to shift in his favor. Initial skepticism about his motives and credibility was being replaced by growing outrage about the fraud that had been uncovered, and admiration for his willingness to sacrifice his career to expose it. Editorial writers who had initially questioned his decision were now praising his courage, and public opinion polls showed increasing support for his actions. More importantly, the evidence gathered by police investigators was making it increasingly difficult for the accused individuals to maintain their denials and counterattacks. Financial records, witness testimony, and documentary evidence were painting a clear picture of systematic fraud that had been operating for several years, with the Royal Association providing perfect cover for their activities. As he prepared to face the challenges that still lay ahead, including formal court testimony and continued media scrutiny, Marcus found strength in the knowledge that his decision had been vindicated by the investigation's findings. The fraud he had exposed was real, substantial, and harmful to both the charitable causes involved and the royal reputation that had been exploited to facilitate it. The Queen Consort had been protected from continued association with individuals who were betraying her trust and exploiting her reputation, even though the process of that protection had been painful and public. The charitable donors who had been deceived about how their money was being used would now have accurate information about the organizations they were supporting. And the children who were supposed to benefit from these charitable efforts would now have a better chance of receiving the help that donors had intended to provide. Marcus Wellington had achieved his goal of protecting the person and institution he had sworn to serve, but the cost had been everything he had previously valued about his life. As he looked toward an uncertain future, he had to hope that the sacrifice had been worth making, and that the courage required to make it would sustain him through whatever challenges still lay ahead. 2 years after the scandal first broke, Marcus Wellington stood outside the Central Criminal Court, watching as Sir Geoffrey Hartwell and 4 other charity board members were led away in handcuffs following their conviction on multiple counts of fraud, theft, and money laundering. The moment he had been working towards since that first difficult decision to speak out had finally arrived, but Marcus felt no sense of triumph or vindication, only a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served and the truth had prevailed. The trial had been a grueling 18-month ordeal that had tested every aspect of Marcus's character and resolve. His testimony had been subjected to ruthless cross-examination by defense lawyers who had attempted to portray him as everything from a delusional conspiracy theorist to a vengeful ex-employee seeking financial compensation. They had dissected every aspect of his personal life, professional history, and psychological state in an effort to discredit his observations and undermine his credibility as a witness. During one particularly brutal day of cross-examination, defense counsel had spent hours questioning Marcus about his motivations for coming forward, suggesting that his actions had been driven by jealousy of the wealthy and influential people he had been assigned to protect. They had insinuated that his military background had left him with psychological problems that affected his judgment, and they had questioned whether his observations of private conversations could be trusted given what they characterized as his obvious bias against their clients. Marcus had endured these attacks with the same disciplined composure that had served him throughout his military and palace careers. He had answered every question directly and honestly, sticking to the facts of what he had observed and heard without allowing himself to be provoked into emotional responses that could have damaged his credibility. His steady, factual testimony had ultimately proved more compelling than the elaborate character assassination attempts directed against him. The prosecution's case had been strengthened enormously by the physical evidence uncovered during the police investigation. Bank records, computer files, and documentary evidence had provided independent confirmation of many of Marcus's observations, making it impossible for the defendants to dismiss his testimony as the fantasies of a disgruntled employee. The money trail was clear and undeniable. Millions of pounds donated for children's medical care had been systematically diverted into personal accounts and used to fund lavish lifestyles for charity board members. Perhaps most damaging to the defendants had been recordings of several conversations that had been made during the later stages of the investigation. Once police had obtained warrants to monitor the communications of the accused individuals, they had captured numerous conversations in which the defendants discussed their fraud scheme, their methods for hiding their activities, and their strategies for discrediting Marcus and other potential witnesses. These recordings had demolished any remaining pretense that their activities had been legitimate or that the accusations against them were unfounded. The scale of the fraud that had been uncovered during the investigation was staggering. Over a period of 6 years, the charity board members had stolen more than £8 million that had been donated specifically for children's medical research, hospital equipment, and treatment programs. The money had funded private jets, luxury yachts, expensive jewelry, and property purchases around the world, all while the charity's actual programs had been systematically underfunded and mismanaged. The impact on the charitable organizations involved had been devastating. 3 children's charities had been forced to close entirely, their reputations so damaged by the scandal that donors had lost confidence and funding had dried up completely. Other organizations had survived, but had required years of rebuilding and rehabilitation to restore public trust and resume their charitable activities. The children who were supposed to benefit from these programs had ultimately paid the highest price for the board members' greed and betrayal. Throughout the legal proceedings, Marcus had maintained his position that exposing the fraud had been necessary to protect both the charitable beneficiaries and the royal reputation that was being exploited. However, the personal cost of his decision had continued to mount during the 2 years since the scandal first broke. His dismissal from the palace had effectively ended his career in security and protection services, as potential employers remained wary of hiring someone whose previous actions suggested he might prioritize his own moral judgments over organizational loyalty. The financial pressures had been relentless. Marcus had been forced to sell his car, give up his apartment, and move in with his elderly parents in Yorkshire while he searched for stable employment. His savings had been completely depleted by legal expenses, and he had been forced to rely on part-time work and unemployment benefits to meet his basic living expenses. The contrast with his previous life of financial security and professional prestige could not have been more stark. The social isolation had been equally challenging. Many of his former colleagues in palace security had distanced themselves from Marcus, viewing his actions as a betrayal of the loyalty and discretion that were fundamental to their profession. While some privately admired his courage, they could not publicly associate with someone whose actions had created such controversy and uncertainty about the boundaries of their professional obligations. Marcus had also struggled with the knowledge that his actions had created significant embarrassment and difficulty for the queen consort, the person he had been trying to protect. While the investigation had confirmed that she had been completely unaware of the fraud being committed in the name of her charitable interests, the public scrutiny and media attention surrounding the scandal had been personally painful and professionally challenging for her. The royal household had been forced to implement new procedures for vetting charitable organizations and board members, and the queen consort had been required to distance herself from several causes she had genuinely cared about while the legal proceedings were ongoing. The spontaneous and personal approach to charitable work that she had preferred had been replaced by more formal and bureaucratic processes designed to prevent future exploitation of royal associations. Despite these costs, Marcus had never regretted his decision to expose the fraud. The conviction of the charity board members had vindicated his observations and confirmed that his concerns had been well-founded. The money that had been recovered through asset seizures and legal proceedings was being redirected to legitimate charitable programs that would actually benefit the children and causes that donors had intended to support. More importantly, the scandal had led to broader reforms in charity regulation and oversight that would help prevent similar fraud in the future. The Charity Commission had implemented new financial reporting requirements and auditing procedures that would make it much more difficult for board members to conceal fraudulent activities. The royal household had also developed new protocols for evaluating charitable associations that would provide better protection for royal family members against future exploitation. On the day of the sentencing, Marcus was approached by Detective Inspector Morrison, who had led the police investigation from its earliest stages. She thanked him for his crucial role in exposing the fraud and expressed her appreciation for his willingness to endure the personal costs of serving as the primary witness in the case. "Mr. Wellington," she said, "I want you to know that your decision to come forward prevented what could have been many more years of theft from some of the most vulnerable people in our society. The children who will now receive proper medical care because of the money that's been recovered owe their lives to your courage in speaking out." Similar expressions of gratitude had come from representatives of several children's charities, from parents of sick children who had been affected by the funding shortfalls caused by the fraud, and from members of the public who had been donors to the compromised organizations. These acknowledgements had provided some compensation for the personal costs Marcus had endured, but they could not restore the career and financial security he had sacrificed. As the legal proceedings concluded, Marcus faced the challenge of rebuilding his life with limited resources and uncertain prospects. His reputation as a whistleblower, while ultimately vindicated, still made him a controversial figure who would struggle to find employment in traditional security or protection roles. At 42 years old, he needed to essentially start over in a new career field with no relevant experience or connections. However, Marcus had discovered during the trial process that his experience and insights might be valuable in unexpected ways. Several organizations involved in charity oversight and fraud prevention had approached him about consulting or advisory roles that would draw on his unique perspective as someone who had observed fraud from the inside and been willing to take action despite the personal costs. The Charity Commission had offered Marcus a position as a special advisor on fraud prevention and detection, recognizing that his experience could help them develop better procedures for identifying and investigating suspicious activities within charitable organizations. While the salary was modest compared to his previous palace position, it would provide stable income and the opportunity to continue protecting charitable causes and donors from exploitation. Marcus had also been approached by several legal firms that specialized in whistleblower protection and corporate fraud cases. His experience as a successful whistleblower, combined with his military and security background, had made him an attractive candidate for firms that needed investigators and advisors who understood both the challenges of gathering evidence and the personal costs of speaking out against powerful interests. Perhaps most surprisingly, Marcus had been contacted by a literary agent who believed that his story would make a compelling book that could help other potential whistleblowers understand both the importance and the challenges of speaking out against wrongdoing. The advance payment for such a book could provide the financial foundation Marcus needed to rebuild his life and establish himself in a new career. 3 months after the trial concluded, Marcus received a letter that he had been hoping for but had not dared to expect. It was from the private secretary to the Queen Consort, written on official palace stationery and bearing the royal seal. The letter was brief but significant. It expressed the Queen Consort's appreciation for Marcus's dedication to protecting charitable causes and her understanding that his actions had been motivated by genuine concern for the welfare of vulnerable children and the integrity of charitable work. While the letter carefully avoided any direct endorsement of Marcus's decision to speak publicly about his observations, it provided the royal acknowledgement he had been seeking that his motivations had been properly understood and appreciated. The Queen Consort recognized that he had acted out of loyalty to the charitable principles she shared, even though his methods had been necessarily disruptive and controversial. The letter concluded with an expression of hope that Marcus would continue to find ways to serve the public interest and protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. While it stopped short of offering any material assistance or employment opportunity, it provided the personal validation that Marcus had needed to fully reconcile his actions with his sense of duty and loyalty to the monarchy. As Marcus began his new position with the Charity Commission, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from palace guard to fraud investigator. The transition had cost him everything he had previously valued: financial security, professional prestige, social connections, and the comfortable certainty of his role within an ancient and respected institution. However, it had also provided him with something he had not expected: a deeper understanding of what it means to serve the public interest, even when that service requires personal sacrifice. His decision to expose the charity fraud had forced him to discover reserves of courage and integrity that he had not known he possessed, and it had taught him that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty requires the willingness to act independently of institutional pressures. The children who had received better medical care because of the money that had been recovered from the fraudulent charity board members would probably never know Marcus's name or understand the price he had paid to protect their interests. The Queen Consort would continue her charitable work with better protection against future exploitation, but within a more constrained system that had been necessitated by the actions of people who had betrayed her trust. Marcus Wellington had achieved his goal of protecting the institution and values he believed in, but he had done so by accepting exile from the institution itself. His story had become one of principled sacrifice, moral courage, and the recognition that sometimes serving something greater than yourself requires giving up everything you thought you wanted for yourself. As he settled into his new role, Marcus found peace in the knowledge that his sacrifice had been meaningful, and that his decision to speak out had ultimately served the public interest. The comfortable certainties of his previous life had been replaced by the more challenging but ultimately more satisfying work of protecting vulnerable people from exploitation and ensuring that charitable resources actually reach those who need them most. The guard who had once protected a person had evolved into someone who now protected principles, and in that transformation, Marcus Wellington had discovered a form of service that was both more difficult and more rewarding than anything he had previously experienced. His sacrifice had not been in vain, and the courage required to make it had prepared him for a new kind of service that would define the rest of his life.